Hey guys, welcome back to Fantasy Hub. Today's story is one of my favorites.
I was drowning in mediocrity, and I knew it. My debut novel, Whispers in the Wind, had landed with all the impact of a paper airplane in a hurricane. 3,000 copies sold, mostly to relatives who'd never cracked the spine. The reviews were kind in that devastating way that's worse than cruelty. A pleasant debut, shows promise, a nice try. Nice, pleasant, the literary equivalent of beige wallpaper. I was working at Metropolitan Literary Review, a magazine that still believed. Print would make a comeback, filing articles about emerging voices while my own voice grew smaller each day. My cubicle sat in the corner like a punishment, surrounded by towers of manuscripts from writers who bled authenticity onto every page while I typed up press releases about book launches I'd never attend. That's when she walked in. Heather Cross, editor-in-chief of Phoenix Publishing. I'd seen her photo in industry magazines, sharp cheekbones, silver hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had better things to do than worry about appearances, eyes that seemed to see through whatever facade you'd carefully constructed. But in person, she was devastating. Not beautiful in any traditional sense, but magnetic in a way that made you forget how to breathe properly. She was there for a meeting with our publisher about some collaboration that would never happen. I watched her from across the office. The way she commanded space without raising her voice, how other editors gravitated toward her like moths to flame, desperate for her approval. And then she looked at me. Not the polite glance you give a stranger, but the kind of look that strips you bare. She excused herself from whatever conversation she was having and walked straight to my desk, her heels clicking against the linoleum. Like a countdown. Jade Gonzalez, she said, not a question. She'd done her homework. Yes, ma'am. The formality slipped out before I could stop it, making me sound like a child caught stealing cookies. I read your book. She picked up the coffee mug on my desk, the one with the chip in the handle that I'd been meaning to replace for months, and examined it like it held secrets. You're a terrible liar. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'm sorry. In your writing, you lie constantly. Beautiful prose, technically sound, emotionally vacant. She set down the mug and leaned against my desk. Her perfume, something expensive and complex cutting through the stale office air. You write like someone afraid of the truth. Heat flooded my cheeks. Around us, the office had gone quiet. Colleagues pretending not to eavesdrop while hanging on every word. I write what I know, I managed. No, her smile was sharp as her pen. You write what you think will sell. There's a difference. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, placing it next to my keyboard. Come see me when you're ready to write what will burn. She walked away, leaving me staring at her card like it might explode. Heather Cross, editor-in-chief, Phoenix Publishing. We don't publish books. We publish revolutions. I should have thrown it away. Should have deleted her number and continued my comfortable descent into literary obscurity. Instead, I called her that night at 11 p.m., standing in my kitchen in pajama pants and a t-shirt from college, heart pounding like I was about to jump off a cliff. Jade. She answered on the second ring like she'd been waiting. I was wondering when you'd grow a spine. I want to write something real, I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. Then come over. We start tonight. Heather's apartment was nothing like I'd imagined. I expected something clinical, minimalist, an extension of her professional persona. Instead, I found myself in a space that breathed with life. Books everywhere. Not organized, but lived in. A kitchen that smelled of garlic and wine. Plants that somehow thrived despite the late hours she kept. It was the home of someone who understood that beauty and chaos weren't opposites. She opened a bottle of whiskey, something expensive that burned smooth, and set me up at her dining room table with a legal pad and her favorite pen. A cross-century classic in silver, she told me, like it mattered. Like everything mattered. When you were trying to excavate truth from decades of lies. Tell me about the first time you lied to yourself, she said, settling into the chair across from me. That's a hell of a writing prompt. It's not a prompt. It's archaeology. She sipped her whiskey, watching me over the rim of her glass. We're going to dig up everything you've buried. I stared at the blank page. My hand hovered over it like a Ouija board, waiting for spirits to move through me. But all I felt was the familiar paralysis, the voice that whispered, "Who do you think you are?" I can't. Yes, you can. Her voice cut through my spiral. Stop thinking about who might read this. Stop thinking about your mother, your college professors, your ex-boyfriend who told you that writers were just failed everything else is. Right. Like you're dying and these are your last words. So I did. I wrote about being 7 years old and knowing that the butterflies in my stomach when Mrs. Peterson, my second grade teacher, smiled at me weren't the same butterflies other girls got when they talked about boys. I wrote about high school, about dating Tommy Martinez because it was expected, about lying beneath him and thinking about anything else, the crack in my bedroom ceiling, the sound of rain on the roof, the way Sarah's hand had felt in mine during the school production of Our Town, Sarah. The pen stopped moving. There she is, Heather said quietly. The ghost you've been running from? I looked up, surprised to find tears on my cheeks. How did you? Because I've been where you are. She refilled my glass, her fingers brushing mine as she handed it back. The touch was electric, intentional. We all have our Sarahs. So I wrote about Sarah, my college roommate, my best friend, my first love, who never knew she was my first love. I wrote about sophomore year, about the night she came back to our dorm drunk and crying about some boy who'd broken her heart, about how she'd crawled into my bed seeking comfort and found something else entirely. I wrote about her lips against my neck at 3 a.m., her whispered, "This doesn't mean anything," even as her hand said everything. About waking up alone while she pretended it never happened. About the way she introduced me to people as my friend Jade with just enough emphasis to draw a line I was never allowed to cross. Keep going, Heather murmured, and I realized I'd been reading aloud without knowing it, my voice growing stronger with each admission. I wrote about graduation day, about Sarah's engagement announcement 6 months later, about the wedding invitation that arrived addressed to Miss Jade Gonzalez and guest, like I was just another college acquaintance. About how I'd thrown it away and then dug it out of the trash. About the dress I'd bought and never worn. About sitting in my car outside the church, wondering what would happen if I walked in, and objected when they asked if anyone had reason. These two should not be wed. I loved her, I whispered, the words falling into the silence of Heather's apartment like stones into still water. I loved her, and she knew it, and she used it against me. No, Heather said, leaning forward. She was afraid. There's a difference. She moved around the table to stand behind me, her hand settling on my shoulders. Her touch was warm, grounding. Read it back to me, all of it. So I did. I read about Sarah and Tommy and Mrs. Peterson and every woman I'd ever wanted, but never allowed myself to have. I read until my voice was hoarse and my hands shook, until the words felt like exorcism. Better, Heather said, but not satisfied. Now write about what you want. I don't understand. You've told me about the past. Tell me about right now. Tell me about what you want so badly it terrifies you. I looked up at her, this woman who'd walked into my life and demanded I set myself on fire. Her hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, silver strands framing her face. Her lipstick had worn off hours ago, leaving her mouth naked and somehow more beautiful. She was close enough that I could count the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough that I could smell her shampoo underneath the whiskey on her breath. I want to stop being afraid, I wrote, the words appearing on paper before I consciously thought them. I want to stop writing around the edges of my life. I want to stop pretending I'm someone else. What else? I want ... I hesitated, pen trembling. Say it. I want you to kiss me. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Heather's hands tightened on my shoulders, and for a moment I thought she might step away, might laugh, might remind me that this was professional, that I was her project, not her interest. Instead, she leaned down and kissed the top of my head, her lips lingering against my hair. Finish the sentence first, she whispered against my scalp. Then we'll see. So I wrote. I wrote about wanting her hands in my hair, her mouth on mine. Her body pressed against me until I couldn't tell where she ended, and I began. I wrote about wanting to be brave enough to take what I wanted instead of waiting for it to be offered. I wrote until the pages were full of desire and fear and hope, in equal measure. When I finally set down the pen, Heather was still behind me, still touching my shoulders like an anchor. There she is, she said again, and this time when she kissed me, it wasn't on the top of my head. It was everything I'd written and more soft and demanding, patient and hungry. She tasted like whiskey and secrets, like everything I'd been. Denying myself for 28 years. When we broke apart, I was breathless, dizzy, transformed. That, she said, her forehead pressed against mine, is what honesty feels like. What followed were weeks of late nights in Heather's apartment, rewriting not just my manuscript but myself. She was a ruthless editor, striking through sentences with the same precision she'd used to dissect my life that first night. This is pretty, she'd say, circling a paragraph I'd been particularly proud of. Pretty and meaningless. What are you really trying to say? She taught me that good writing wasn't about beautiful language, it was about necessary language. Every word had to earn its place on the page. Every sentence had to advance the story or reveal character or break your heart a little. Everything else was just showing off. Write like you're paying for each word, she told me, marking up another page with red ink. Like every unnecessary adjective is costing you something precious. The work was brutal. She'd make me rewrite the same scene 7 times until I wanted to throw the laptop across the room. She'd circle a sentence and say again in that voice that broke no argument, that quiet authority that made something deep in my chest tighten with want. But slowly, something extraordinary began to emerge. My protagonist, initially a thinly veiled version of myself, started to breathe on her own. The love interest stopped being a fantasy and became a person with flaws and fears and complicated motivations. The story I've been trying to tell for years finally had a voice. You're getting it, Heather said one night, reading over my shoulder as I typed. Her hand rested on the back of my neck, thumb tracing small circles that made concentration nearly impossible. Listen to that rhythm. Feel how the sentences flow into each other. I did feel it. For the first time in my life, I felt like a real writer. Not someone pretending, not someone hoping to get lucky, but someone who had something to say and the skill to say it well. Our relationship during those weeks existed in a strange space between professional and personal. She'd kiss me goodnight when I left her apartment at 2 a.m., but we didn't talk about what we were becoming. She'd touch my hand when she passed me coffee, let her fingers linger on my shoulder when she leaned over to read what I'd written, but we focused on the work. The work was everything, until the night I finished the first draft. It was 4 a.m., and I'd been writing for 6 hours straight, lost in the final scene where my protagonist finally tells the truth to the woman she loves. My fingers flew over the keyboard, the words pouring out like they'd been waiting my entire life to be written. Don't, I breathed, hitting the final period and leaning back in my chair. Heather looked up from the manuscript pages she'd been reviewing, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose in a way that made her look both scholarly and slightly vulnerable. How does it end? She asked. Read it. She set aside her papers and came to stand behind my chair, leaning over to read the screen. Her breath was warm against my ear, her presence solid and reassuring at my back. I closed my eyes and listened to her breathe, feeling something settle in my chest that I'd never experienced before. Peace, maybe, or completion. Jade, she said, softly when she'd finished reading. Is it awful? No. Her arms came around me from behind, crossing over my chest in an embrace that felt like coming home. It's perfect. It's exactly what it needed to be. I turned in her arms, looking up at her face in the soft glow of the computer screen. She looked tired but triumphant, like a general who just won an impossible battle. We did it, I whispered. You did it. I just helped you find what was already there. Heather, she silenced me with a kiss, deeper this time, more certain. When we broke apart, she took my hand and led me away from the computer, away from the work that had brought us together toward her bedroom and whatever came next. The book launch was everything I'd dreamed of and nothing I'd expected. Phoenix Publishing had arranged a reading at the Strand, and somehow, impossibly, people came. Real people who'd bought my book with their own money, who laughed at the right moments and sat in rapt attention as I read passages that had once felt too personal to share with anyone but Heather. She watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, wearing the slight smile that meant she was pleased, but trying not to show it. 6 months of working together had taught me to read her expressions like weather patterns. This was pride carefully contained. I was signing books afterward, still floating on adrenaline and disbelief, when I heard a laugh that made my blood freeze. Little Jay Gonzalez, all grown up and breaking hearts in print. I looked up to find Sarah Matthews, Sarah Reynolds now, according to the wedding ring that caught the bookstore's fluorescent lights, standing at my signing table with a copy of my book in her hands. She looked exactly the same as she had in college. Blonde hair still perfect, smile still devastating. Time had been kind to her in the way it usually was to people who'd never doubted their place in the world. Sarah. My voice came out strangled. I didn't know you were in New York. Conference. She set the book down in front of me, open too. The title page. Pediatric Cardiology. I'm a doctor now. Can you believe it? I could believe it. Sarah had always been the type of person who achieved what she set out to achieve, who moved through life with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. That's wonderful, I managed, taking up my pen with hands that had started to. Shake, what would you like me to write? How about to the woman who inspired it all? Her voice was soft, intimate, like we were alone instead of surrounded by strangers. The book was clearly autobiographical. Anyone who'd known me in college would recognize the parallels. But Sarah's assumption that she'd inspired it felt like a slap. Like she thought my entire journey of self-discovery was just an elaborate love letter to her. Sarah, I read the whole thing on the plane. She leaned closer, her perfume familiar and nauseating. The character based on me, the college romance that never quite happened. Jade, it's beautiful. Heartbreaking, but beautiful. I glanced toward the back of the room where Heather had been standing, but she was gone. Probably giving me space to handle this on my own, or maybe unable to watch me be reduced to the stammering mess I became whenever Sarah was around. It's not about you, I said quietly, signing my name with sharp, angry strokes. Isn't it? She picked up the book, flipping to a passage I knew without looking, the scene where the protagonist finally admits she's been in love with her best friend since the day they met. This happened, Jade. Maybe not exactly like this, but it happened. She was right, and we both knew it. That night in our dorm room, her tears and my comfort, and the line we'd crossed that she'd pretended didn't exist the next morning, it was all there in the book, transformed but recognizable. "You hurt me," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I know." Her voice was gentle, genuinely sorry. I was 20 years old and scared out of my mind. I didn't know how to handle what I was feeling. And now? She was quiet. For a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of my book. "Now I'm married to a wonderful man who loves me and doesn't understand why. I cried reading your book on a plane full of strangers." The confession hung between us like a challenge. Around us, the bookstore was emptying out, the last few customers making their purchases and heading home. Soon it would just be us and whatever conversation we'd been avoiding for 8 years. "Sarah," I never got to explain. "You graduated and disappeared, and I never got to tell you why we couldn't, because you're straight." The words came out bitter, exhausted, because it was just experimentation for you, and I was convenient. "No." Her hand shot out to cover mine, the touch electric and familiar. "Because I was terrified. Because my parents had expectations, and I had plans, and you were this beautiful complication I didn't know how to fit into my life." I stared down at our hands, her wedding ring cold against my skin, and now I realize I should have been braver. Should have chosen love over convenience. Her thumb traced across my knuckles, the gesture so gentle it made my chest ache. "Should have chosen you." The words I'd waited 8 years to hear, and they felt like stones in my stomach. Too late, too complicated, too much. Sarah ... I know it's unfair to say this now. I know you've moved on, that you're happy. I saw how that woman looked at you during your reading like you hung the moon. She squeezed my hand, but I needed you to know. Before I go back to my life, I needed you to know that you mattered. That what we had mattered. I pulled my hand free, suddenly desperate for space, for air, for Heather's steadying presence. "I need to go." "Jade, wait." But I was already gathering my things, signing the last few books with trembling hands, desperate to escape before I said something I couldn't take back. Before I admitted that part of me, some pathetic 20-year-old part still wondered. What would have happened if she'd been brave enough to love me back then? I found Heather waiting outside the bookstore, leaning against the brick wall with her phone pressed to her ear. She ended her call when she saw me approach, her expression carefully neutral. "Ready to go?" she asked. "You saw her." "Hard to, miss." Heather pushed off the wall, studying my face in the glow of the streetlights. "Want to talk about it?" I wanted to say no, wanted to pretend that seeing Sarah hadn't shaken me to my core, but Heather had taught me better than that. Had taught me that honesty was the only foundation worth building on. She said she should have chosen me. Heather nodded like she'd expected as much. "How do you feel about that?" "Angry, sad, confused." I shook my head, trying to clear it. Like she's 8 years too late and 8 years too early all at once. "What does that mean?" "It means if she'd said it then, I would have followed her anywhere. And if she says it now..." I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "If she says it now..." I looked at Heather, this woman who'd taken my broken pieces and helped me reassemble them into something stronger, something truer, who'd seen my potential when I couldn't see it myself, who'd kiss me like I was worth wanting and challenge me like I was worth saving. If she says it now, it doesn't matter, because I'm not the same person who loved her anymore. Relief flickered across Heather's face, so quick I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for it. "Are you sure?" she asked. Instead of answering, I kissed her right there on the sidewalk outside the bookstore where I just had my past and future collide. I kissed her like she was my answer to every question I'd ever asked, like she was home and adventure all at once. When we broke apart, she was smiling, not her careful professional smile, but the one she saved for moments when she forgot to guard herself. "Let's go home," I said. "Your place or mine? Whichever one has fewer ghosts." She laughed, the sound bright and surprised in the night air. "Mine, then." "Definitely mine. But ghosts, I learned, have a way of following you home." Sarah showed up at Heather's apartment 3 days later, somehow having tracked down the address through methods I didn't want to examine too closely. I was working on my second book, a story that had nothing to do with college or lost love, or the woman I used to be when the doorbell rang. Heather answered it, and I heard Sarah's voice drift down the hallway like smoke from a fire I thought I'd extinguished. "I need to see Jade, please. She's working." "This won't take long." I set down my laptop and walked to the front door, finding them facing each other like gunslingers at dawn. Sarah looked smaller somehow, less polished than she had at the bookstore. Her perfect hair was windblown, her makeup smudged like she'd been crying. "It's okay," I told Heather, though I wasn't sure it was. "Let her in." Sarah stepped into the entryway, her eyes taking in the warm chaos of Heather's apartment, the books and plants and evidence of a life fully lived. When her gaze landed on me, something in her expression cracked. "You look happy," she said. "I am happy. Good. I'm glad." She twisted her wedding ring around her finger, a nervous gesture I remembered from college. I left him. The words dropped into the silence, like stones into still water. Heather's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but I felt the tension radiating from her like heat from a flame. "Sarah, I know how this looks. I know the timing is awful and selfish and probably cruel." Her voice broke on the last word. "But reading your book, seeing you again, it made me realize I can't keep living someone else's life. So you're here to what? Collect me like a consolation prize?" The anger in my voice surprised all three of us. "No." Sarah shook her head, tears spilling over her cheeks. "I'm here to apologize. To tell you that you were right to run from me, right to build a life that didn't include me. I would have destroyed us both." She looked at Heather, then really looked at her for the first time. "She's good for you? I can see it in how you hold yourself, how you speak. You're not hiding anymore." Heather stepped closer to me, not possessive, but protective, her presence a reminder that whatever I'd been, I was something else now. "I'm not the same person who loved you," I said, echoing what I'd told Heather outside the bookstore. "I know." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache with phantom pain. "And I'm not the same person who was too scared to love you back. But that doesn't change what we were to each other." "What were we to each other, Sarah?" "Everything. For one night, we were everything." She took a shaky breath. "I need you to know that I remember. All of it. The way you looked at me, the way you touched me like I was something precious, the way you said my name like it was a prayer." Heather's hand found mine, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture of solidarity and claim. Her touch grounded me, reminded me where I was and who I was and what I'd built since that night in our dorm room. "I remember too," I said quietly. "But I also remember the morning after, the way you pretended it never happened. The way you introduced me to people like I was just your roommate for the rest of college. I was afraid. I know you were afraid. I was afraid too. The difference is that I was willing to be afraid with you, and you decided to be afraid alone." I squeezed Heather's hand, drawing strength from her steady presence. "I forgive you for being scared, Sarah, but I can't forgive you for making me feel like something to be ashamed of." Sarah nodded, accepting the judgment without argument. "You're right. You deserved better then, and you deserve better now." She looked at Heather again. "Take care of her. She's special." "I know," Heather said simply. Sarah moved toward the door, then paused. "Your book, it's brilliant, Jade. Whatever else happened between us, whatever I cost you, it led you here to this. She gestured around the apartment, at Heather, at the life I'd built from the ashes of who I used to be. Maybe that's enough. After she left, Heather and I stood in the silence of her entryway, holding hands like survivors of some natural disaster. Are you okay? She asked. Are you? I asked first. I considered the question seriously. Sarah's visit had shaken something, loosened me, some last vestige of the girl who'd waited by the phone for calls that never came, who'd written love letters she'd never sent, who'd shaped herself around someone else's fear. Yeah, I said, surprised to find it was true. I think I am. Good. Heather lifted our joined hands to her lips, pressing a kiss to my knuckles. Because we have work to do. Work? Your second book isn't going to write itself. And I have some ideas about the third. I laughed, the sound echoing off the walls of her apartment, our apartment, I realized, though we hadn't had that conversation yet. We would eventually. We'd have all the conversations that mattered, make all the promises worth keeping, build something that could weather whatever storms came our way. But for now, we had work to do. Stories to tell, truths to excavate, words to bleed onto pages, until they became something worthy of the love that had inspired them. Lead the way, I said, and followed her back to the desk where my laptop waited, cursor blinking against the white screen like a heartbeat, like a beginning, like everything I'd never been brave enough to hope for. 2 years later, I stood up, a podium in the grand ballroom of the Roosevelt Hotel, holding an award I'd never dreamed of winning, the Lambda Literary Award for Fiction. My second novel, a story about finding yourself in the aftermath of almost love, had somehow managed to capture something universal in its specificity. The audience was a sea of faces, writers and editors and readers who understood the particular courage it took to tell certain kinds of stories. But my eyes found Heather in the front row, her silver hair gleaming under the stage lights, her expression proud and slightly amused, like she'd always known this moment would come. They say write what you know, I began, my voice carrying, clearly through the ballroom's perfect acoustics. So I wrote about being lost, about loving the wrong people for the right reasons, and the right people for reasons I couldn't understand. About the woman who taught me the difference between settling and choosing, between accepting what was offered and demanding what I deserved. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the audience until it landed on Sarah, sitting 3 rows back with tears in her eyes and a proud smile on her face. She'd divorced her husband 6 months after our confrontation in Heather's apartment, had started dating women, had sent me a letter about finding her own editor, a kind woman named Rebecca, who challenged her to be braver in all the ways that mattered. Some stories ended with reunion, but ours had ended with forgiveness and the freedom that came from letting go. I wrote about being afraid, I continued, and about the woman who taught me how to burn instead of beg. The audience laughed, a warm sound that washed over me like applause. But I was watching Heather, who had gone very still in her seat, her hand moving to something in her jacket pocket. Love isn't about who finds you first, I said, the words I'd written and rewritten until they felt like truth. It's about who helps you find yourself. The applause was thunderous, but it faded to whisper quiet when Heather stood, pulling a small velvet box from her pocket. The gasp that went through the audience was audible even from the stage, and I felt my heart stop beating for several impossible seconds. Jade Elizabeth Gonzalez, she called out, her voice carrying despite the fact that she wasn't wearing a microphone. Will you marry me? The question hung in the air like a challenge, like everything we'd ever said to each other about truth and courage and taking what you wanted instead of waiting for it to be offered. I looked down at her from the stage, this woman who'd taken my broken pieces and helped me forge them into something stronger, who'd seen my potential when I couldn't see it myself, who'd loved me not despite my complications, but because of them. Only if you promise to edit the hell out of my vows, I called back. And the audience erupted in laughter and cheers and the kind of joy that comes from witnessing something real and unscripted and perfect. She slid the ring onto my finger later, backstage, while the after party raged around us. It was a simple band, elegant and understated, exactly what I would have chosen if I'd been brave enough to choose. How long have you been planning this? I asked, admiring the way it caught the light. Since the night you finished your first book. She kissed my temple, her lips warm against my skin. I knew then that you were going to change the world. I wanted to be there to watch. Just watch. Okay, maybe participate a little. Her smile was wicked, full of promise and mischief and all the years we had ahead of us. After all, someone has to keep you honest and edit my work and edit your work and love me even when I'm impossible, especially when you're impossible. She cupped my face in her hands, her thumbs tracing along my cheekbones. That's when you do your best writing. Outside the hotel, New York City hummed with its eternal energy, millions of stories unfolding simultaneously in the grid of streets and lights. But inside that backstage room, holding the woman who taught me that love was something you built rather than something that happened to you, I felt like the only story that mattered was the one we were writing together, one honest, word at a time. So, Heather said, her forehead pressed against mine, ready for the next chapter? I thought about the blank document waiting on my laptop at home, about all the stories I had yet to tell, about the life we were building together in the space between ambition and contentment. I thought about Sarah finding her own way to happiness, and about the girl I used to be who never believed she deserved to be chosen. Always, I said, and kissed my editor, my love, my future, while the city sparkled outside and our story continued, unedited and unafraid, into whatever came next. The sound of typing filled the silence later that night, not the desperate clacking of someone trying to capture lightning, but the steady rhythm of someone who had finally learned the difference between writing from fear and writing from love. Between the pages of our life, between the words we spoke and the ones we saved for the page, we built something that could withstand revision, something worth editing, something that would last long after the final draft was done. And if sometimes, late at night, I still heard the ghost of my former self whispering doubts and fears and all the reasons why I wasn't worthy of this happiness, well, that's what editors are for. To strike through the unnecessary words, to highlight what matters, to remind you that every story worth telling requires the courage to begin again.